I just wanted just to start, it's very brief, just introduction, just to remind ourselves really why we're here talking about food and climate change. So yeah, we're here because the world faces a climate emergency. Climate change is already costing lives around the planet and having devastating impacts, particularly on the world's poorest communities. And these impacts will increase in the coming years and decades, but the full extent of the impacts depends on how quickly we can act worldwide to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're here for people like Obissa on the picture, who is a subsistence farmer in Ethiopia. Tier Fund report that over the last few years, rainfall in her area has reduced dramatically because of climate change. Obissa says, in the past we had rainfall every 6 months, but now we don't know when the rainfall will come. The length of the dry season is increasing. As a result, Obissa is struggling to give her children adequate food and water and is walking for an increasing number of hours to collect water every day. The UN reports that the previous trends of reducing world hunger reversed in 2014, and world hunger has been increasing again every year since 2014, primarily because of climate change and conflict. And these two things are closely related because climate change exacerbates the risk of conflict. The figures in 2019 from this report were 8.9% of the world's population were undernourished. That's just short of 700 million people. They also reported in the 2018 report that the number of climate-related disasters, including extreme heat, droughts, floods, and storms, has doubled since the early 1990s. So we're here for people like Surya from Bangladesh, who lost his home and all his possessions to flooding. And we're here for his children and grandchildren, because sadly, Bangladesh is extremely vulnerable to the sea level rises that will occur with climate change. And we're here for our children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews in this case, godchildren and so on, who will be living in a planet affected by climate change for the decades and generations to come. But we're also here because as Christians, we have hope that God will not abandon his creation and his people, that he has won the ultimate victory to redeem the world through the cross. We know that God works through his people, and therefore we'll have an important, a vital role to play, but we can take this on with hope, I believe. And tackling climate change will involve urgent prayer, campaigning for governments and corporations to make far-reaching and rapid changes, as well as changes to our own lifestyles. And as a church at St. George's, we're on a journey of learning and acting in these areas. We did an overview training session in October and November last year. I think most if not all of you were there, but if anyone did miss it, you can catch up on the recorded version, which is now on the St. George's YouTube channel, just here. So now we're spending some time focusing on different topics in more detail today, starting with food, which is one important aspect of our individual carbon footprints. And thank you to David, who's spent a lot of time researching this topic to share with us today. I'm just going to also just have a short prayer just to give us a little bit of time to reflect on that, and then I'll hand over to David. We come to you, Lord of creation. We know that your people around the world are not immune to suffering and difficulty, but you tell us not to be afraid because you are with us. You committed yourself to your creation by becoming flesh and dying for us. And you ask us in response to be wise stewards. At St. George's, we heard last week in the sermon that wisdom involves understanding, knowledge, and commitment. Help us today, as we think of one aspect of our response to climate change, to grow in wisdom, understanding, and commitment. Amen. So I'm going to hand over to David.
Right, good afternoon. Food is important to us all. Eating food is not just about getting the nutrition we need. For many of us, meals have a social function as well. We eat with people, We talk to people while we eat. We may invite people for a meal when we can, and we may go out for meals with people. Perhaps we celebrate something. Many of us have particular meals or food that we like. If you asked me what my favourite meals were, I can't actually tell you what the food was, but I can tell you about where I had them. Top left there is HMS Victory in Portsmouth Dockyard. Some years ago, when I was a naval reservist, all commanding officers of reserve Navy units were invited for a meal on board HMS Victory with the Commander-in-Chief. And we had our meal right at the stern there in Nelson's cabin. I can't tell you what we had to eat, but the meal itself and the surroundings were wonderful. Another meal underneath there, bottom right, that's in San Diego in America. If you go there at lunchtime and you sit out and have your meal, while you're there, you can see naval jets coming in, coming out, helicopters coming in, coming out, ships coming in, coming out. I absolutely love it. So those are two of my favorite places for meals. First of all, can I reassure you that I'm not going to tell you what you should eat or what you should drink or what you shouldn't eat or drink this afternoon. What I am going to do is to give you some information. You can consider it, and then it's up to you to make some of your own choices in this area. Now, making choices with regard to whether it's food or energy or whatever, it takes time. The advice is that you don't do it very quickly. You take time to do it. And of course, if you're living with other people, then you need to bring them into the equation as well. Not everybody will want exactly what you want, and you'll have to come to an agreement together with those in your household as to what you want. Those of you who attended the October Zoom session may remember that I said that Pope Francis suggested that we all need an ecological conversion. Now, I'd like to tell you about this lady, Sarah Bridle. Now, I don't want you to put it in the chat, but just have a look at the picture, see if you can guess where she is. The clue is she's not far from Manchester. And she's at Jodrell Bank. Sarah Bridle is a professor at Manchester University. She's a physics professor, and her expertise is extragalactic astronomy. She's an expert in something known as dark energy. Dark energy may explain why the universe is expanding and getting quicker. Now, a few years ago, three things happened to her all at the same time. Firstly, her professor in Cambridge told her that he'd developed cancer. Secondly, after 10 years of work, some results came through on a big project which she had been working on. And thirdly, her children began school. She said suddenly that she felt empty. All that she was working for seemed to have finished. She wondered what the point of it all was. So she decided she needed to embark on something that would make the world better. And so she said, I'm going to have a look at the idea of what we should be eating and diet and climate change. And so she ended up writing a book on the subject. That's it. Some of the statistics that I use are based on her book. It's an excellent book. I can thoroughly recommend it. It's easy to read, but if you want it, all the science stuff, she's got loads and loads of references in it that you can look up if that's what you want to do. If you want to remember her name, she has done a TED talk on food and climate change. You might like to look at that at some stage. It's about 15 minutes long. But I'll begin with the information that she begins with in her book. She tells us that of a family's carbon footprint in the UK, 25% of it comes from what we eat and how we cook it and how we get it. So our diet is responsible for 25% of our carbon footprint. First of all, let's look at how we waste food. 1/3 of food is wasted globally. In Western countries, 70% of all food waste comes from our home. And the most wasted food, vegetables, salads, drinks, and bread. You might want to think whether that's true for you. So the first thing to, sorry, back to there, some facts. 2007, a UN Sustainable Development Goal was that we reduce our food waste by 50% between 2007 and 2030. We've currently reduced it by 27%. The UK's current annual food waste is equivalent to filling 66,000 three-bedroomed houses. That's a city or town the size of Peterborough. Another way of looking at it, a UK family wastes the equivalent of 8 meals a week. An area the size of Wales would be needed to produce the food we currently waste. So here's the first thing to consider. Can I reduce my food waste? Now here's a slide many of you will have seen before in Ewan's presentation, and it shows you the carbon footprint of different foods. And if we go to the top, you'll see that by far the highest impact food is beef. And it's got a huge variation in the impact that it makes on the in terms of CO2. It can be low impact or high impact. Much of the beef we have in Britain, if it's farmed locally, is low impact. If we go to America, much of it is high impact. Then you go down to lamb, various other bits and pieces, chicken, milk, and so on. So beef is by far the biggest contributor to CO2. Then there's methane. Cows are responsible for a large amount of methane emissions. The methane comes from burping, and on the right-hand side there, you've got the global equivalent, CO2 equivalent of buffalo beef, milk, pork, chicken. Again, beef is very large. Cattle can be reared in a number of ways. This is traditionally what we think of as the British cow. Looks like the Lake District to me, but I don't know whether it is. Although they're out in the fields in the summer, in the winter, many of our cows are indoors to protect them from the bad weather. Some of you may have heard of American beef farming in feedlots like this, where they may have up to 150,000 head of cattle. Now, be wary of making emotional judgments about how happy or how well looked after cattle are, depending on how they're reared. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not looking at it. What I'm looking at is the amount of greenhouse gases that they produce. Now, I said that the carbon footprint of a British cow is generally quite low. In fact, it's 2.5 times lower than the global average. How do they manage that? Well, some of you may get your milk from Goodall's farm up the Wetherby Road. If you do, here's some pictures of the farm. Now look at the picture on the left. When Lynn and I went there about a year ago, the guy who helps run the farm gave us a talk on how the farm works. And what you have on the left there is a self-milking cow. Most farms, you see, the farmer puts the cow in a pen, then it's milked, and then it's pushed out the other end, and it goes back in the field or wherever. Not so on Goodall's farm. On Goodall's farm, the cow can decide itself when it would like to be milked. And when it wants to be milked, it lines up and goes in this pen. When it's in the pen, there are cameras and computers and lasers and all the rest, and the cow is milked electronically, automatically, no human involved. When the milking's finished, the cow leaves, and as it leaves, it gets its back rubbed on a roller. Cows love having their backs rubbed, so that's part of the reward for them being milked. The guy there says on average, their cows they milk themselves 3 times a day rather than 2 times a day, which is how they're normally milked. And he said that because they're self-milking, they give 30% more milk. In addition, most of the energy to run the farm comes from the slurry, manure, and everything else on the farm. Look at the right-hand side there. That produces most of the electricity, in fact, 85% of the electricity that is used on the farm, all coming from manure. Other farms use their free energy in different ways. If you go to Hollywood in Northern Ireland, you'll find a farm there, Blakiston Houston. They make so much energy, they sell it to the national grid. In addition to heating polytunnels that they use to grow salad crops. Farmers can also reduce the cow's carbon footprint by changing its diet, for example, using seaweed, certain oils, and pulses. Nevertheless, it remains true that cows are responsible for methane emissions, which are 20 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. Some will produce less, some produce more, but there are 2 particular problems with cattle aside from producing methane. Firstly, some of them are fed on a diet which includes a lot of corn. And that corn is often grown on pastures that are built on or set on deforested land. So the forest is chopped down, the area there is used to grow corn. So you've got a negative effect of the trees coming down because they absorb CO2, and also the effect of growing the corn, which then feeds the animal. Secondly, demand for meat is increasing. That's a chart showing demand for meat in the third world or the developing world in kilos per year. As you can see, it's going up and up, and then you've got estimates for 2030 and 2050. Why is it going up? Because people in the developing world are becoming richer, and partly because the population is growing as well. That means more methane and more land being converted from forest to cattle production. The demand in the developed world is also rising, but not as quickly as it is in the third world. You may be familiar with some scientific research that says eating too much meat is not good for your health. And eating too much processed meat is particularly dangerous, as is eating meat that's been grilled too much so that some of it is burnt. Here's the conclusion of a study in 2016. The evidence-based integrated message is that it is plausible to conclude that a high consumption of red meat, and especially processed meat, is associated with an increased risk of several major chronic diseases and preterm mortality. Let me tell you about one of my former students called Richard. When I taught at Lawnswood, I was on bus duty at the end of the day. And one lad called Richard came to get on the bus, and he'd made this, I forgot what it was, I don't know, a big table or cupboard or something in his woodwork lesson. And he couldn't get it on the bus, and he was a bit worried about taking it on the bus. So I said, look, if you can wait 45 minutes, I'll take you home and the cupboard in my car, then it won't get damaged. So that's what we did. So I arrived home at Richard's house to be greeted by Richard's mum. And Richard's mum says, oh, hello, Mr. Kibble, nice to see you. I'm cooking Richard's tea. Richard's having burgers, beans and chips. It's what Richard eats every day. He won't eat anything else, so he has it every day. Certainly not good for him, not good for his health. Scientists are also encouraging us to eat fewer dairy products: milk, cheese, yogurt, ice cream. So a brief word about this. A study by a guy called Joseph Poore from Oxford University has said that in terms of carbon emissions, vegetable milks are responsible for 1/3 or less of the emissions used in the production of cow's milk. With regard to land use, 1 litre of cow's milk takes 9 square meters, whereas food-based milk, they take less than 1 square meter. All of them involve less water than cow's milk. And here you are. Those are the environmental emissions of a glass of different milks. And you can see dairy milks up the top, then you've got rice, soy, oat and almond below. What does the average British diet look like in terms of producing greenhouse gases? There you are. Beef and lamb, for the average British diet, constitute 23% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Milk products count for 20%. I wonder if you've ever looked at the government's dietary guidelines. You probably haven't. But what it's telling us is that Brits eat twice as much red meat as we need to, and we're eating 25% less fruit and vegetables than we should do. You're now going to go into breakout rooms, and I'm going to ask you to discuss 2 questions. The 2 questions are this. First, what are your thoughts on what you've heard? Secondly, how might we encourage people to consume less in the way of meat and dairy products? The questions will be in your chat at the bottom of the screen. Okay, part 2. This is where I'd like to introduce you to some of the statistics published by Sarah Bridle, who I introduced you to earlier on. At the moment, she says that the average person in the world causes 6 kilos of gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions per day through their diet. In the US, that average is 13 kilos. And she says if we're going to reduce our emissions by half, then maybe we should be looking at a target something around 3,000 emissions, 3 kilo emissions per day. So let's look at some of her statistics. Okay, here we are, Bolognese. If you have beef Bolognese, you'll see the vast majority of grams of CO, of carbon dioxide equivalent are from the beef itself. The tomatoes and other bits and pieces don't take very much. Beef, enormous, nearly 6,000 grams. Chicken, a lot less. Lentils, even less. And what about a curry? Lamb, okay, the lamb itself, 5,000 grams, nearly 6,000 grams. The corn and the chickpea, a lot fewer grams of CO2 equivalent. Vegetables. Now, the difference between the left-hand one and the middle one is that the beans in the middle one have been flown in from Ethiopia, Kenya, or wherever. The ones on the left have been grown locally in Britain, and therefore the transport costs are minimal. So you've got huge cost of freighting your vegetables in by air. Also, in column 1, the green beans are microwaved rather than cooked on top of an oven. My wife says hob, sorry, yeah, on top of the hob. How about some fruit? European orange, hardly any equivalent grams. Caribbean banana, a bit more, but a proportion of strawberries, huge. It's the air freighting them in that takes that produces the grams of CO2 equivalent. So if you fly goods in, it's not good for climate change. If you buy local or something that's not come in by airplane, you're doing a lot better. And for those of us like me who like coffee, here we are. This is what coffee looks like. Shipping costs. This is a geese line banana boat coming into Portsmouth commercial docks. Portsmouth handles 70% of bananas coming into the UK. They have a ripening facility there. The ships bring them in, they ripen on land, and then they're sent off to supermarkets around the country. But 70% of our bananas come through Portsmouth. That ship there, Timor Stream, is one of a number that bring bananas in. Because I'm the sort of person I am, every so often I watch the ships coming into Portsmouth and watch the banana boats coming in and out. There's Timor Stream, Clipper Stream, Benguela Stream. There's one in there at the moment, Baltic Clipper, which has delivered its bananas and is on the way, will be on the way back tomorrow morning to Barbados. Now, although shipping costs are low, I'm not convinced that Sarah Bridle in her figures takes into account the cost of building the ships. When you work out the climate change cost, you've got to build in not just the cost of the fuel that the airplane or the ship is using, but also the costs of building the ship or airplane. But nevertheless, DEFRA, one calculation DEFRA has made, says that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's 44 times more efficient to ship goods by sea than by air. 44 times. So we need to ask whether we should be buying foods that are air freighted in. There you are, blueberries there flown in from Peru, and beans there flown in from Kenya. So one of the things we should try and do is to buy locally. The transport costs will be a lot smaller. And if we want to have frozen fruit and vegetables out of season, then the best thing is to buy them frozen. Have them picked and frozen in Britain and then buy them in your supermarket or shop. Nutritionally, frozen food is actually much better for you. Let me give you an example. If you bought a 250-gram punnet of strawberries grown in the UK, that uses 490 grams of CO2 equivalent. But if they're flown in from South Africa, as some of them are, then it's not 490 grams, it's 3.5 kilos. So in terms of climate gases, it's producing 7 times the amount by being flown in. If we want to make changes to our diet, how might we go about it? Here we are. Firstly, make decisions about what you actually want to do. Do you want to reduce red meat, reduce milk products, reduce waste, increase vegetarian products? Decide what it is you want to do. When you've done that, give yourself some targets. For example, reduce red meat to however many times a week. Include so many vegetarian meals a week. This will all take time to work through and to talk through with your household. In fact, while you were all in your breakout groups, Izzy and I were talking about how we've done this, and it takes time. Research suggests that if you're going to do this properly, it will help if you plan your meals and your shopping. A lot of people shop on impulse or shop for a couple of days and then go back and get some more. It's much more effective if you plan your meals and your shopping. And you can influence your friends. In addition, buy locally when possible, avoid unnecessary packaging, and use low carbon cooking methods. For example, don't leave lids off saucepans. Use a microwave or a pressure cooker. Well, of course, you're all asking, okay, Kibble, what have you done? Well, a few years ago, we moved to one vegetarian meal a week. We're now moving to 2. We always have 2. Occasionally, we'll have 3 vegetarian meals a week. And we're reducing our red meat to, well, I've written down here 2. Actually, I think it's nearer 1. We've increased our fish from 1 to 2 some while ago. Oh, Lynn's chatting next to me. So we don't always have red meat. Maybe it's once a fortnight for red meat. Now, our son, Johnny, he said to us a little while ago, him and his fiance had been watching one of the David Attenborough programs. And at the end of it, they said, right, that's it. We've got to change our diet. So they went for some vegetarian burgers, vegetarian sausages that you see here, made by Heck up in North Yorkshire. And they started using vegetable milk, and they started on oat milk. So we bought those a little while ago. I now use oat milk about more than half the time for my breakfast. And once a week, once a fortnight, we'll use these about once a fortnight, once every 3 weeks, together with other vegetarian meals. So we're trying some new recipes, things like vegetarian curries. Tomorrow I'm cooking Moroccan eggs. That's, you cook eggs in vegetables and you flavour them with harissa paste. Some vegetarian meals can be a bit boring, so you do need to spice them up with spices. Mushroom risotto, lentil and bean bake, vegetarian crumble, vegetarian lasagna, pasta. There's a number of things that you can try. You have to look for them. Another one I'm trying on Wednesday is a Palestinian recipe called rumaniya, except you need aubergines for it. And I'm told at the moment, aubergines aren't very available in the shops, maybe as a result of Brexit. So who might change their diet? A study was published in June that looked at why people might or might not change their diet after they'd been given information like this on climate change. The study used over 1,200 people. They did what they call an intervention, talked to them about climate change and diet, and then they asked them to see if they would change their food, and then got them back a few months later. This is what they found out. 111 out of the 1,220 people thought that diet was a factor in climate change. But after the intervention, a lot more realised food was important, 633. Frequent meat eaters are less likely to believe that diet and climate change are linked, either before or after the intervention. Thirdly, women have a greater knowledge of climate change than men. And many men associate meat eating with health. People with prior health concerns are more likely to respond to messages about diet and climate change. When I was doing my teacher training, one of the books we read was a book by 2 guys called Young and Wilmot called Family and Kinship in East London. And one of the things you read there was how men in East London were very keen on having meat nearly every day. And I remember when I started teaching in the 1970s in a school in Holbeck, I used to get my meat from a local butcher. And one day I was in the butcher, there was a lady in front of me, it's a very working class area, and she said to the butcher, "Oh, a man's got to have his meat, got to give the man meat." We can't save the world on our own. Us changing our diet will not. It will help, but it won't solve the problem. We need to get governments to act. In 2008, number 2 there, food labelling, some companies actually tried labelling food with regard to climate change, but it didn't work because people weren't that interested at the time. Maybe they didn't understand what it was, so that was taken off. But whatever happens, they found that if you label food with red, orange and green labels, first of all, the food company will try and get smaller red labels on as possible. And secondly, the public will try and avoid red labels. So it does actually work. You can tax foods that have a heavy carbon impact. You might think, oh, that's a bit unfair, isn't it? Well, originally, we didn't like the idea of having to wear crash helmets on motorbikes. People said, oh, that's taking away our freedom. Now, everybody wears a crash helmet. We don't think anything of it. It's legislation. Similarly, seat belts. Also, restrictions on smoking, cigarette tax. We even have a sugar tax now. Most companies have just adapted. So legislation does work. And we need to reduce subsidies for emission-intensive foods. That's difficult and it takes a long time. You can't suddenly say to farmers, don't produce this anymore. They've got to have an alternative and that will take time. So consider, how might we begin to change our own diet? What steps do we need to take? How might we encourage others to make changes to their diet? Now, I'd like to go back into your breakout rooms again for about 10-12 minutes. The questions are, firstly, what steps have you already taken or might you take to change your diet? Secondly, how might we influence others, including those who appear resistant? Okay, to your breakout rooms, and then you'll come back for a quick roundup at the end. See you in a minute. Well, that's it, folks. I hope you found the session useful. I hope that some of you will be able to confirm the choices you've already made, or perhaps begin to make some decisions. One of the most important things is that you actually plan what you'd like to do, make some decisions, and then set yourself some goals. That way, it will work. Let's close together with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to hand back to Ewan. Lord, we thank you for your wonderful creation. May we do all that we can to preserve it. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, David. Yeah, I've heard that twice, and I think I've picked up different things both times. So I found that really helpful, and I can see people nodding. So yeah, thank you very much for all the work you've put into preparing that, and people clapping. Wonderful. Great.
I'll tell you now what Ewan said originally. For any of you who know me, Ewan said to me, "Oh, you like food? Perhaps you could do the one on diet." So that's why I'm doing it. That's why I'm doing it.
I wasn't well. We prepared.
I like food.
We all like. Well, yes. The context of that, which I think is helpful, is that we were preparing the previous session, which covered a whole range of topics, and I could tell that David was getting more and more interested in the food side of that. So, yeah, that was the inspiration there. So, but yeah, as Izzy said, we've got other sessions that we're planning. They're listed out on the church website, so keep an eye out for those. A recording of this will be made available as well. So if you think, oh, there was something that was said about this and I can't quite remember, or you think someone else would find it interesting, it won't go up immediately, but hopefully in a week or so it will be on the church website and you can find that link and send it around. One thing that Izzy just mentioned whilst you were in the breakout group that might be helpful, in the first session I mentioned one of the things that we found helpful in changing our diet was to get a veg box that comes weekly, although I think you can arrange it to be fortnightly as well. That there's a company called Riverford who do them, and they guarantee that nothing is air freighted, and it's mostly grown in Britain, or comes by ferry and truck from continental Europe, and yeah, and you can choose different options, but they you don't necessarily choose everything that's in the box. So you get things and you think, oh, this is an interesting vegetable, what can I do? And then you look up a recipe that's based on that vegetable, and they put some recipes in the box to give you some ideas, and we find it really helpful. But it's just a way of getting into a new habit about what we eat. And that, I think that's the challenge, and we've all found, obviously in the last year, habits have had to change for one very big obvious reason. But yeah, it's something that can be a voyage of discovery as well. But yeah, great. It's good to see you all. And I look forward to seeing you in other church events soon.